The Many Saints of Newark is the long-awaited prequel movie to the classic mob drama The Sopranos, brought to us by the very creator of The Sopranos, David Chase. As The Sopranos is a household name, watched and re-watched by millions of people and counting, the movie, which came out 14 years after the show ended, of course generated hype, and now that the film is out, numerous people have been giving their thoughts on the film, and that includes Michael Franzese. Now, I'm guessing people who frequent my channel will know who Michael Franzese is, but for those who don't, he is a former New York mobster who was a capo of the Colombo crime family. He was even name-dropped and depicted briefly in Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas. Perhaps his most well-known and lucrative racket was the scheme he helped implement to defraud the government out of gasoline taxes, and he claims that at the height of his career, he generated $8 million a month. Franzese is something of an enigma because he is one of the few rare cases of a high-profile mobster leaving the life after being released from prison in the 90s and still being a successful and wealthy businessman. Not turning rat, not going to witness protection or anything like that, just straight up retiring, denouncing mob life as evil. His retirement sparked a need to relocate with his wife and children, after death threats were sent to him and contracts placed on his head, including allegedly one by his own father, who was also in the mob. Today, Franzese is a motivational speaker for youth at schools, prisons, and other venues. He's written books on his life and self-help works, and he is also a born-again Christian. You do wonder sometimes how much of this is genuine because, after all, the church, self-help books and courses, these things can in of themselves be rackets, but let's assume the best. He has helped people, and he is a very interesting figure who has great advice about crime, business, and life in general. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about Franzese is that he's a YouTuber. Yup, this former high-ranking gangster of one of the most powerful American crime families who may or may not have murdered people, and definitely knew murderers, torturers, extortionists, etc., is now a fascinating storyteller and entertainer on YouTube. What a world we live in, eh? And I believe it was he who started this into a trend, as we now have YouTube channels from the likes of former mobsters Sammy the Bull and Frank Culotta, who recently passed away. And one of the things that Franzese does is review mob movies, which is a fascinating experience to have this guy who is deep on the inside reviewing all of these movies about the mob, telling us what was real, what wasn't, what was authentic. Sometimes his reviews do tend to go to a place where it's just him saying, "Yeah, I knew this guy. Yeah, I knew that guy. We were close." But it's still a wonderful and novel experience to have an actual former mobster go through these mob movies. I don't follow him too closely, but he is a very interesting character, and I look forward to his film reviews and Mob Story Mondays. Some subscribers have asked me to make videos on him, but to be honest, I think it's a bit pointless because what's the point of watching YouTube videos from me, a random guy, about Michael Franzese when you can literally just go straight to his own YouTube channel? But there is one video I wanted to comment on of his. I don't really take an interest in his more political videos. I know Franzese is quite politically driven, but I'm not American and I'm more interested in the film reviews and his stories from his days in the mob. And from the little I know of Franzese and his media persona, he seems like a pretty introspective guy, with it being common for him to have productive thoughts to share. But I watched his review of The Many Saints of Newark, and I was quite frankly flabbergasted at his thoughts, and so I wanted to review and react to it here. I don't know if he was having a bad day or something's going on in his life, but he seemed uncharacteristically emotionally invested in his review to a point where he was blind to simple facts in order to maintain his opinion. Now, Franzese didn't like The Many Saints of Newark, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. He's completely within his rights not to like it. In fact, it seems the film in general has had a negative reaction from audiences. But with some of the things Franzese came out with during this review, I was like, what? So, let's take a look.
And I can only tell you this, David Chase, if I had you in front of me, I wish I was still in the mob.
Okay, so we start with a vague threat at David Chase's life because Chase had the audacity to make a movie.
Now, before I start, and everybody's been asking me about it, just came out, October 1st. Before I start, let me tell you this. The Sopranos was one of the greatest series of all time, if not the greatest, because not only was it great, but it was groundbreaking. It led the way for all the other series, great series I might add, to follow. It kind of elevated television series. I loved it. I'm going to be honest, I didn't see the entire series, Hey, I'm a former mob guy. Sometimes I don't watch all the mob stuff. Maybe you don't understand that. Hopefully you can.
So here he has a disclaimer where he says he hasn't seen all of The Sopranos. He still claims it's one of the greatest series of all time. I'm not sure how you can ascertain that as your own personal opinion if you haven't seen all of the show, especially as in a previous video, Franzese implied that he had actually only seen a few episodes here and there of earlier seasons. And the reason why I point this out is because it's so important, seeing as though much of the criticisms he has for Many Saints are also present in The Sopranos, which he deems arguably the greatest show in the world.
It was a brilliantly written show, a brilliantly acted show. Some of it wasn't always tremendously authentic, didn't have to be, because the storylines were great.
Again, important to point out because of what he says in his review of Many Saints, the fact that The Sopranos wasn't always authentic, but it didn't need to be because it was entertaining.
And I want to make this very clear right now, I did not like it at all. I didn't see any redeeming qualities in this film at all. For me, it failed on every level. I'm going to get even deeper on that. Personally, I was a little bit offended by the movie. Not as a former mob guy. Well, maybe a little bit as a former mob guy, because so many things that I saw were not what happened in my former life. But as an Italian American, I feel a bit offended. And I think any Italian American that watches this movie is going to feel the same way, because they portrayed us as really bad people. Italians, across the board, just really bad people. And I didn't like that. I thought it was unnecessary.
So he didn't like the film. He didn't think it had any redeemable qualities, and that's fine. But then he says he was offended by the movie. That famous word which is so often thrown around today by the politically correct crowd. I lost count of the amount of times he said he found the film offensive. And then he says that any Italian American that watches the film would feel the same way. And that, quite frankly, is bizarre. Of all the complaints I've heard about this film, it tried to do too much, poor acting, poor structure, too woke. Of all of the complaints, I've never heard Italian Americans complaining that the film was offensive to them, that it portrayed them as really bad people. All of these gangster films that Franzese has seen, reviewed, and he says he loves to bits, like Goodfellas and The Godfather, what, did these films portray Italian Americans as lovable people? Of course not. They're even more barbaric in those films, more selfish and narcissistic, especially Goodfellas, as that was one of the whole points of the film, to de-glamorize the mob. And since when were these films making sweeping statements about Italian Americans and Italians? They're not about Italian Americans, they're about gangsters, mobsters, those who leech off society and give Italian Americans a bad name. And need I remind Franzese, he was a mobster. He was the very kind of person that people would read about in the papers, and because of what he did and the life he lived, people would make generalizations about all Italian Americans. An ex-mafia member complaining about Italians being viewed in a bad light? What a wicked irony. And the funny thing is, the very complaint he's making has already been addressed in The Sopranos, in that one scene where the family sit around the table. I think it was Dr. Melfi's family, and they complain that all you ever see of Italian Americans in movies is with gangster films. And the family praise and toast the vast majority of Italian Americans who are not criminals. Clearly, Franzese hasn't seen this episode, and my mind is boggled that an, albeit reformed, mafioso who in the same video is boasting that Neapolitans like him were the backbone of the mafia is complaining that a movie about the mafia makes Italians look bad, and the irony is lost on him. I think people like you are the ones that made Italian Americans look bad from your old life, and it's people like you who inspired media entertainment like Goodfellas, like Casino, like The Sopranos. And nowhere in Many Saints is there ever some kind of commentary that Italian Americans are bad people. That is just ridiculous. The movie is concerned with low-life criminals who kill people close to them because they laugh when they fall down the stairs and come home from prison after 4 years and immediately start abusing their own family.
This whole contrived thing with, the racial issue that they brought in. The blacks, rioting in Newark at that time. Yeah, there was some truth to that, but they weren't rioting because of Italians.
Some truth to that? The 1967 New York riots swept entire cities. 26 people were thought to be killed, and hundreds injured. And nowhere in the film is it ever claimed that they rioted because of Italians. What film did Franzese watch? They even showed why the riot started, with the black guy getting pulled up by the cop, and later one tells Dicky Moltisanti that black people are rioting because they think the cops have killed him. Italians never even entered the equation.
And there was no rivalry between Italian Americans and the mob and the blacks at that time. Didn't happen. So why that had to be created in this film, I don't know. You know, to me, it was almost like, are you trying to create animosity between, you know, what former mob guys were and blacks? Are you trying to do that? I didn't see any reason for doing that. And it was kind of disturbing, especially in this climate. What do we need that for? Number one, it wasn't true. And number two, why do we have to put that in people's psyche, in their head? Hey, the mob guys didn't like blacks. You know what? I'm going to say this out front right away, and people are going to knock me for it. Yeah, Italian mob guys were prejudiced towards blacks. Let me tell you something. Prejudice exists in every race, nationality. It's just the way it is. It wasn't specific for mob guys against blacks or blacks against mob guys. That's not true. Some of my dad's dearest friends and some of my friends were black, African American, whatever. That's nonsense. And I'm telling you that right now. And so I don't care if you knock me for it. That's the truth. That wasn't my experience growing up.
A lot to unpack here, but for him to say that there was no racism towards black people by the mob, calling it nonsense, is nonsense. The evidence is documented and overwhelming. And Franzese uses that age-old cliche, almost literally saying, I'm not racist, I've got black friends. If we're going to play that game, I've got a work colleague who's Italian, and he said he was openly racist to blacks in his youth because that's just the way things were back then. Why is Franzese trying to paint a hunky-dory rainbow image of life back then? And Franzese goes on about needing the race stuff in this climate, and he of course is alluding to the riots that started after George Floyd's murder. But the Many Saints of Newark was shot before the modern riots, so it's not as if they're trying to gain advantage of this. They already had this story visualized. Maybe Franzese doesn't know this, which is fair enough, but so what if there were recent race riots? Does that mean we're all of a sudden not allowed to make movies about riots? This is just like that ridiculous situation where a scene in a movie theatre was removed from Gangster Squad because someone in America went on a shooting spree in a cinema. What's next? A terrorist attack happens or somebody gets kidnapped and Liam Neeson is suddenly out of a job? In fact, having the 1963 riots in the film after the recent riots actually adds to the film, because it's as if it's saying so much has changed after all this time, and yet ultimately nothing has changed. And Franzese is insinuating that the movie is instigating racial tension? How? By showing things the way they were? And what's the solution? Censorship? Minimizing the rampant racial tensions? So that we can pretend in films set in 1967 Newark that Italians and blacks were holding hands, singing around campfires? Isn't that exactly the woke mentality that Franzese complains about later on in the video? Franzese says, what do we need that for? As if the Many Saints of Newark is a public community service video that has to show some kind of progressive message, and it's not a movie where the filmmakers can make whatever art they want to. And also, Michael, you say it wasn't your experience growing up, but the movie is not called Michael Franzese's Experiences Growing Up. It's called The Many Saints of Newark.
Racism exists in the world. It will until the end of time. It didn't have to be portrayed in this movie falsely as it was. I don't know what that was trying to accomplish. You know, they even brought it like it was a war between the blacks and the Italians, the mob.
No, it wasn't a war between Italians and blacks. It was one black man, Harold, who worked for the mob and then went rogue, wanting to go into business for himself. What kind of exaggeration is this? Even showing images from the film with what looks like a war-torn area with a black guy throwing a projectile. That's from the Newark riots, not a race war.
It was just offensive. It was unnecessary. I don't even know why it was brought in. Are they trying to be woke at this point in time? If you're going to be woke, do it the right way. Do it with class. You know, do it with integrity. You don't try to start more trouble. That's not what movies are about. That's number one.
The sheer irony of Michael Franzese complaining that the film is woke when his very complaints are woke. He's offended. He doesn't like the racism in the film. All cliches of the political correct woke cancel culture crowd that he and pretty much all of us despise so much, and he doesn't see the irony of it at all.
It was almost a defamation of character of Italian Americans, period. Not only mob guys, but Italian Americans.
You know who he sounds like here?
You know what it is? I'll tell you what it is. It's anti-Italian discrimination.
Whatever happened to Gary Cooper? That's what I want to know.
Ray Liotta is upset with his wife. He actually slaps her. and he slaps her. I'm not even going to repeat the reason why. She left something hanging in the bathroom that he didn't like. It was truthfully an offensive scene for me. And so he slaps her around, ends up throwing her down the stairs. Now, come on. Why was that necessary? You know, there's this preconceived notion, I think, because of the media, because of the movies, that mob guys slap their wives around, are disrespectful to their women. You know, that's not true.
What are you talking about? It's like he's literally taking the piss here, that he's doing it on purpose. Literally all of those gangster films that you love and praise, Goodfellas and The Godfather, all contain scenes of husbands beating their wives. And of course, The Sopranos. In fact, the scene between Hollywood Dick and his missus is a homage to a scene in the show with Janice and Ralph. Christopher constantly beat Adriana, Richie smacked Janice, Tony almost strangled Gloria to death, Ralph murdered the stripper. Did you even actually watch the show, Michael, or were you just saying what your media team told you to say? Because now I'm at a stage where I'm doubting if you've even seen it. But like I said, he's already admitted he's only watched a bit. This is such selective outrage. Where is your anger at all those movies and TV shows with husbands hitting their wives? And while we're at it, you make vague threats about killing David Chase, but you've had Chaz Palminteri on your show, the man who wrote and starred in A Bronx Tale, a gangster film where the B-plot was about racial tensions between Italians and blacks. And you never brought it up then and criticized him for that when he was sitting right there in front of your face? We don't even need to go to A Bronx Tale. The Sopranos has numerous scenes dedicated to discrimination against black people by the mobsters. I've yet to hear you complain about it, Michael.
I don't think it's something that mob guys do. It's something that disturbed men do.
Exactly. So what are you complaining about? Get off your high horse. Christopher abuses Adriana. Hollywood Dick abuses Giuseppe. Dickie even kills her. These are all disturbed men, all related to each other. Dickie in particular is psychologically tormented, and Hollywood Dick is clearly supposed to be an asshole, not the Pope.
Dickie says to him, you know, don't ever hit her again. And they have an argument about it, and he says some things again that are very offensive. The language is terrible. And Dickie ends up punching Ray Liotta, his father, in the face. He says, you hit my mother, and now you're hitting this girl. Don't ever do it again. They have some dialogue. Dickie Montesanti doesn't like it. What happens? He goes to work on his father, ends up killing him, beats him to death in the car. I mean, come on. Is this necessary? It's an untrue story. It's not fact, so why put this kind of stuff in there? You're making Italian Americans look bad? You're making mob guys look bad?
I mean, this is just so weird. He's so off the mark that I think he might have just found the film to be poor, and it sent him into an emotional tangent. So language in mob movies is terrible all of a sudden? Dickie killing his father is not facts. So what? Is this a documentary? It's a film. It's fictional. It's make-believe. And again, the irony of Franzese saying, you're making mob guys look bad. He's looking like a parody by this point. For someone who's so level-headed and thoughtful in his discussions, I just don't know what happened to him in this video.
Now, mind you, the guy's away 4 years. He walks into his house. There's everybody there to greet him, his wife, you know, Tony Soprano Jr., the whole thing. Everybody is there to greet him, right? What does he do? He walks in the door. The first thing he says to his wife, why didn't you tell me that blacks moved into the neighborhood? That's the first thing he says. Guy does 4 years in prison, comes home. Everybody's planning a party. They're all happy to see him. And that's the first thing he says? Why are you trying to create some kind of a racial war between Italians and blacks? That never happened.
Well, yeah, Michael. He comes home after 4 years and instantly starts complaining. That's to show us what a nasty, unapproachable guy Johnny Boy was. A complete departure from the way Tony idolized him when he looks back at his youth. Where are you getting your race wars from?
And then somebody in there says, hey, you know, he's a doctor. The black couple that moved in, the father's a doctor. And somebody else says, well, I wouldn't use him to heal me. Or I wouldn't let him be my doctor. I mean, is that kind of dialogue necessary?
When did you become such a snowflake, Michael? Everybody's complaining that the movie was woke and the characters weren't racist enough towards black people. And you seem to be the only person complaining that a family full of mobsters in the 60s were too racist. And the guy who made the doctor quip was Paulie, who was a 2006 honoree for excellence in recycling, not political correctness.
Dickie Montesanti sleeps with a black guy, has sex with him. They show the scene, unnecessary, but that's it.
What? What does that mean? How else would they establish she had sex with him?
He gets infuriated. This is terrible, worst thing in the world. He takes her into the ocean and he drowns her there. I mean, is this necessary? Is this part of a story that you can get into? As an Italian American, I'm offended by this. This is nonsense. And you know what? If I were on the outside looking in and I didn't know better, and I'd say, this is what mob guys do? This is what Italians, this is the kind of behavior.
Michael, you keep saying mob guys and then Italians, as if you can't have Italians who aren't in the mob. You're contributing to the very stereotype you're criticizing. When he brought this scene up, I thought he was going to go on about how he can't understand why Giuseppe would tell Dickie that she slept with Harold, which is a common complaint, and I looked forward to him talking about it. But again, it's just another box in the checklist of all the things that offended Michael in the movie, because apparently it's saying all Italian men have drowned a Gomar or two.
I don't know if I reviewed it, but if I did, it would almost be as bad, but I wouldn't take it personal, and that was the Gotti movie with John Travolta. The only movie I know that got 0 on Rotten Tomatoes. This one should be -0. So Travolta and Gotti did a little better than this one, that's for sure. Actually did a lot better.
Oh, come now, Michael. Like Obi-Wan would say, you've become blinded by your anger. Worse than Travolta's Gotti? Not in a million years. So let's leave it there, guys. I don't know, man. I was getting more and more confused the longer I watched the review. If someone doesn't like the film, that's perfectly fine. But you'd think they dislike it based on its merits, not because every second of the frame offended you because you're seeing things that are just not there. So what did you think of Franzese's review? Do you think he was off his game on this one? Am I wrong? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.